Welcome. I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ann Magazine's Ground Truth, and today we're going to be talking domestic politics, the 2020 election, Comrade Bernie Sanders, and where we're all going from here. With us to help us illuminate those topics, great guest Steve Yates, former Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice-President Dick Cheney, currently CEO of a company called DC International Advisory. And you can follow him on Twitter at YatesDCIA. Mr. Yates, welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's dive into this. Obviously looking for your viewpoint here. I find it remarkable to observe this current just hard left turn of the Democratic Party. I mean, at this point in time, right now, we got Bernie Sanders leading the pack, a self-described socialist. I'd frankly call him a communist more accurately. But in any event, a party that seems to now be presenting an agenda that I don't think Barack Obama could get on board with. What's happening and how do we get here?
Well, that's a good question. And I do think that today's left is almost unimaginable to people who were Democrats, say, when John F. Kennedy was running for president. They're definitely not part of what used to be called blue dog Democrats back in the 80s and the 90s that supposedly Bill Clinton had marshaled to pull together his coalition to come to the White House. I just think that today, someone in the media that's far left just labels themselves moderate. The Democratic Party is just far to the left of that. There's a friend and mentor of mine that early in my political trajectory said that extremes beget extreme reactions. And so we had the extreme of Barack Obama's agenda, and we had the Tea Party reaction. And I don't say extreme in a bad way, it's just that the pendulum swing was strong. Then because I think of the Barack Obama tenure, which was smooth talking but very radical in its policies and realities, it provoked a very, very strong reaction from the center and the right. And that's what I would consider the Trump movement to have been. It was kind of a recalibration of what it meant to be a Republican nominee. Took a different tack on foreign policy, trade, and a few other issues, but abided by some very, very simple ideas of, I'm going to tell you who I'm going to nominate as judges, they're going to uphold the Constitution as normal people understand it, and we're going to pull the country back into what as Donald Trump would say, is where it belongs. And it turns out that millions and millions and millions of Americans identified with that, and he pushed. That, I think, is almost a death blow to the globalist progressive movement. And that's why I think they fight so hard right now. And when they fight that hard, it begets this, I think, panicked extremism on their base. And Bernie plays into that.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. The really, I would describe it as the populist nature of the Trump agenda, with which I personally identify,
right.
And to the extent to which it seems to me a lot of political commentators don't really recognize that. Maybe they don't want to talk about it. They keep trying to portray him as being, I don't know, a Republican in a mold that, of 10, 20 years ago.
Right. Well, it's just a fact that the traditional approach of Republican candidates was going to leave us with results like in 2000 and 2004, where while I supported him and I worked for him, the George W. Bush won by a hair's breadth. I mean, those were very, very close elections. And then the 2008, 2012, where our nominee got smoked in 2008, 2012, Romney just couldn't push it across the finish line. And so the traditional approach doesn't work. And people want to just look at the style, but there's way more substance to what President Trump is doing than people recognize at first blush. And it's that substance that gives the momentum and the power to the movement he has. And he's redefining what a winning, I think, center-right coalition can be. And that, I think, is just very, very damaging to the Democrat brand, because they felt like, by way of the media and the coastal elites, they could just impose their will on the masses. And now I think that people see an agenda and a persona that's willing to fight back. And that's what I think the Trump momentum is. And I really don't see anything coming out of the Democratic Party that can honestly compete with that going through this 2020 cycle. If it's close at all, it's going to be by gaming the system and just unfair media influence.
So Vice President Biden's out there floundering right now. What do you think happens with him? What do you think is happening, and what do you think is going to happen with him?
Well, I have to say, with some sarcasm, it really breaks my heart to see Joe Biden once again prove that he is a horrible campaigner, because he has run for president seemingly dozens of times. It's been a handful at least, and every single time there's the idea of Joe Biden, and it gets out there on the field, and it's just like one of these athletes that's a star in his own mind, goes out there and just doesn't put points on the board. It's possible that he will have some kind of a so-called firewall in South Carolina, and he remains a viable candidate. But I think he didn't just come in second. He came in like fifth and sixth in Iowa and New Hampshire. And unlike Mike Bloomberg, he was trying. He showed up. He was campaigning. He even actually got combative with some voters, which I don't advise as an electoral strategy. But I think that just the idea of Joe Biden is not very strong. He was put forward as kind of the conventional, the mainstream for the Democratic Party candidate. Sometimes they would use the word moderate, even though the things he's campaigning on now are not moderate. It's just not working. So I think that Joe Biden's collapse was foreseeable from the beginning just because of his past performance as a candidate. And I think we now have kind of a Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders kind of redux, and it's just that the Clinton part of it is by proxy. And the Joe Biden supporters thought they were her proxy, but I think that she will drop him like a hot rock, and we'll see where the more conventional swamp creatures, as Trump would call them, want to go within the Democratic Party to rally against the Bernie momentum.
So I'd like to touch briefly, I'd like to come back to Bernie in a minute, but touch briefly on Bloomberg. You were talking before about your description of really what the Trump movement, if that's the correct term, is about. Again, what I always refer to as sort of a populist movement. And it seems to me personally that Bloomberg doesn't understand any of that. That what he sees is Trump's a billionaire, Trump became president, I'm a billionaire, I can become president, without tapping in actually to any groundswell of any kind. Like there is no movement behind him. What are your thoughts on his candidacy?
Well, I think there is no movement behind Mike Bloomberg also. There are some people who are residents of New York City that were fond of his tenure as mayor. I'm not a resident of New York City, and I'm not super fond of his tenure. I think Rudy Giuliani was an historic and transformational mayor of New York City. I didn't agree with all of his politics, but the results up there were undeniable during his time. I don't think Mike Bloomberg can hold a candle to what Rudy Giuliani did by way of transforming and pulling that city forward. But I think that Bloomberg, like a lot of people, they miss the important substance behind Trump. Trump recognized that our country, in a supermajority, definitely among Republicans and independents, but also among Democrats, feel like we've been ripped off by the country of China. And that our elites, in foreign policy, trade policy, and a number of other ways, have given unnecessary concessions to a government and an economy with which we're competing. Doesn't have to make them an enemy. Now, I do personally consider the Communist Party of China to be an enemy of the United States, but the people of China don't have to be our enemy. And if we had better economic arrangements, stronger national security posture, perhaps we can manage that better. But for the last several decades, we've had a very accommodating view. And I think you can point directly to Trump's approach on China as one of the key ways he changed the electoral college strategy. If you look from western Pennsylvania to Minnesota, obviously he almost won Minnesota, it came close, But that stretch, there were a lot of voters that had a history of either not voting or voting Democrat that came on out for a Trump rally and came out to vote for Trump. And he won more than many people thought he could across that way. And it just transformed American politics in a microcosm, but it's a big substantive part. Mike Bloomberg is directly at odds with that policy idea. He's very much in the mainstream kind of elitist view that there's nothing really different about the Communist Party of China and the United States of America. They have their human rights problems. We have our human rights problems. They have their constituencies they have to deal with. We have our constituencies we have to deal with. And I just don't think that translates to mainstream. But the other part is personal. When people who are just sort of average, everyday folk meet with Donald Trump, they know that he's a very wealthy man. Yes, he was born at a station in life that a lot of us can only imagine and don't really identify with. But when he talks with average, everyday people, they don't feel like he's talking down to them. They feel like he is with them. He is among them. And that he will make the world safe for them and their way of life. When Mike Bloomberg engages those people, even though he's smaller, as Donald Trump likes to point out, they don't feel like Mike Bloomberg is one of them, and they feel like he's talking down to them. And you can see it in some media exchanges, you can see it in some of the candidate exchanges. And those, I think, are the two big misses for a Bloomberg candidacy. If he comes out as a Democratic nominee or runs as an independent, I really don't like his chances up against the Trump agenda or even the Trump style of politics.
So let's assume that for a moment that Bernie continues on this trajectory. And I mean, Bernie Sanders, I think I saw a poll yesterday that had him up nationally by, double digits. We don't know, you never know with a poll like that exactly how real that is. But let's just assume right now that he actually continues to rack up wins and it looks like this guy's actually going to get the nomination. Is there a point at which the Democratic Party tries to stop that, or are we past the point in history when they can do that?
Well, there's some significant differences in the structure of the nominating process for the Democratic Party and the structure for the nominating process in the Republican Party. And so in 2016, I was a chairman of a state party, and I was a part of the RNC process and the convention in Cleveland. And there was a lot of talk going into Cleveland about a brokered convention and would there be a movement to try to unseat Trump as a nominee. There were some people who were for Ted Cruz that were advocating that. There were people who were just against Trump that were advocating that. Structurally within the Republican Party, there's a lot of breaks against that happening, and Donald Trump, by way of the Republican nominating process, had racked up a sufficient number of committed delegates to go in with a win. A lot of the Republican primaries and caucuses, mostly primaries, are winner-take-all. And so you end up with a prohibitive lead if you start racking up wins. The Democratic Party hands many of their contests results out as proportionate representation. And so there's a much higher likelihood of a plurality nominee going into the Democratic convention. So someone who has more committed delegates than the others, but not a majority of committed delegates. And Sanders would be a perfect typecast of that kind of a candidate. If he continues his string, he would end up with more delegates than others, but there could be a lot of coalition changing, and you could have what people refer to as a brokered convention for the Democrats. It's a very plausible scenario, much more plausible for Democrats in 2020 than it was for Republicans in 2016. And I do think that there is sufficient bad blood between pro-Clinton legacy supporters versus Bernie, but also whatever support Bloomberg is carving out in this, you can see in the early ads and the back and forth that there's no love lost between them or their supporters. So it seems to me like the Democrats are in a profoundly disunified state right now, and Bernie's lead will exacerbate that.
So if we go into a Democratic convention, as you've described it, trotted out this scenario, where Bernie has the most delegates, but he ultimately is not the nominee. What do his supporters do? I mean, if they walk out of that convention and he had the most delegates, but he is not now their nominee, do they unify or do they fracture?
Well, it seems to me it would be fracture. I don't know what your experience or your listeners' experience has been on that lovely platform known as Twitter, but if you say anything unkind or unsupportive of Bernie Sanders, there's some super not nice people out there that are ready to roar back at you at any moment. And they don't seem to have any softer social skills in person when it comes to politics. That would be a very, very damaging development for the Democratic Party if it played out that way. There would be a certain momentum among some to just say, look, their overwhelming objective is to defeat a common enemy from their point of view and denying President Trump a second term. But if you go back to the famous Democrat saying of all politics being local, I don't know that it's so easy to bridge that divide. And politics is a game of numbers. It's addition and multiplication rather than division and subtraction. I think that a sizable part of the Bernie base would not unify behind any nominee other than Bernie, especially if he ended up with a plurality of votes. But I even think if it's close and Bernie isn't either the top or the running mate on the ticket, that they won't vote in the fall. And so I think there's a significant risk to the Democratic Party going through this process, which, as a partisan Republican on my part, just warms my soul.
You're fine with that scenario, as am I personally.
Yeah.
Looking into your crystal ball, what do you think's going to happen in November?
Well, the one thing I would just offer by way of caution is really from 2015 until now, we've been in uncharted waters in terms of political analysis, commentary. The greatest sin that has been committed in recent times has been trying to apply conventional thinking to unconventional candidates and unconventional times. So all the conventional analysis about 2016 was just flat wrong. And even though I'd like to think that I'm a part of the unconventional movement in all of this, we just sort of grasp for straws about how do we assess how this is going. When we reach to things like polls, which we know by now is like Lucy and the football, these things just kind of are held out there, and every time we want to believe a poll, things change again. So the one caution I would give is this has been a very fast-changing cycle for the Democrats. We had Joe Biden in a walk. We had it competitive. You had Elizabeth Warren pop up, pop down. You've got Buttigieg popping up, and who knows where he's going. And so this is likely to change again before it settles. But right now, my crystal ball says we've got a fractured Democratic Party. You're going to either end up with a Bernie or a pro-Clinton-like nominee with the plurality of votes, a fight for the Democrats, and I just think it really, really helps the Republicans' chances generally in the Senate and the House, and especially the president's reelection.
So let me shift gears on you just as you know we're moving in to the later stages of the interview. We've spent, this is my verbiage, the last 3 years, ever since the president was elected, in sort of a slow motion coup or series of coup attempts, trying to negate the results of the 2016 election. And we now have this Durham investigation. You think there are going to be indictments? You think people are actually going to get prosecuted coming out of what's going on over the last few years?
Well, first I would say certainly they should be. There are things that were done by people in very high station for which lesser folks have lost their careers and livelihoods and reputations many times over. And I think that the greatest assault on the national security apparatus of the United States of America took place in the waning years of the Obama administration. That is where they actually did all of the things that they want to accuse the Trump administration of doing. They actually did it. And so I really think it is warranted. I think the Attorney General Barr is serious about that, and he's just the kind of Attorney General who I think has the will and the ability to bring cases like that. But until I see an example of it, it's one of those things where you have an outcome that you think would be right, and part of you hopes it would be brought to bear because it would restore faith in your faith in the system. But until we see some things done, just color me skeptical on getting that across the finish line.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think I think a very large number of Americans are in the same camp with you. It should happen. God, please let it happen. But I will believe it when I see it. NSC, the president has been pretty aggressively reducing the size of the National Security Council. And prior to my retirement from the agency, I had some interaction with that edifice, which I think was already, in my opinion, too large. What are your thoughts?
Well, the Republic survived for 2 centuries without a National Security Council. And so it's kind of hard to argue that it is the only thing standing between between sort of American success versus American failure in engaging the world. I do think that there is a role and a function for the president to have staff that he can rely upon for candid advice, analysis, and support protected by executive privilege. I am all for transparency and accountability in government, but we elect presidents to be a chief executive, and I don't support allowing our enemies to have a leg up on what our internal national security deliberations are, and that's what happens if we don't have that kind of a functionality. So I support the functionality. It bloated a lot over the years. When I was in the White House, it expanded a lot after 9/11. It got even bigger under the Obama years, up to, I think, over 400 employees. And those are largely borrowed from agencies. I fully support National Security Advisor O'Brien's approach of returning detailees, as we call it, to agencies. And if you want to work at the White House at the pleasure of the president, be an employee of the White House. And the Congress should appropriate a budget sufficient to that need. And I also support the idea of skinnying down the staff. The truth of the matter is, we have a president who, more like past presidents and people want to admit, will read at most 4 or 5 items before going into a meeting. And he'll say what he chooses to say, which is the right of the commander-in-chief. So why bother with all this death by memos? Why bother with this bloated staff? Why bother with a bunch of self-appointed people, or self-important people, who want to come in and deign to tell the commander-in-chief what the will of the American people is or what the policy of the United States of America is? So I think this is a good course correction, but I think it's one of those things where it just takes constant gardening. And so whoever follows Robert O'Brien, whether it's at the end of the Trump administration in 2025, in January, or what have you, it's going to need to be something that's sustained. Because the build-up from Kissinger through Obama was significant.
Last point I'd like to touch on with you, because this has just come out in the news over the last day or so. Senator Murphy meeting with the Iranian foreign minister, apparently without the knowledge of the U.S. Senator Murphy meeting with the Iranian foreign minister, apparently without the knowledge of the Trump administration, because he says he doesn't trust Donald Trump, I guess, so he needs to conduct his own foreign policy. Thoughts?
Well, number one, there is a law called the Logan Act that gets cited every once in a while, and so this senator wins the hypocrisy award of the day for engaging in the very behavior that he wanted to persecute, not just prosecute, Michael Flynn for. Michael Flynn was a distinguished member of the military and of the intelligence community on the transition as National Security Advisor, engaging in consultations with the Russian diplomats and others as he prepared to take office. And the Democrats, including the senator, basically called for his head on a platter. And so he wins an hypocrisy award. Now, I think the Logan Act is something that's never really been used in a meaningful way for over 200 years, and my view of laws are, if they aren't used effectively in 10 years, then maybe they shouldn't be on the books anymore, and if it's over 200 years, get rid of the law. But it's hypocritical, unhelpful, as they would say, for Senator Murphy to be doing this. But in the grand scheme of things, there could be nothing more foolish on the Iranians' part than believing anything this extremist Democrat would say. They know who the boss of the bloc is right now. There's only one president at a time, and he's the one that I think is appropriately applying maximum pressure to them.
Thank you, sir, for making the time. I really appreciate the clarity of your insight.
My pleasure. I appreciate the chance to talk, and I'm happy to do it again anytime.
Thank you, and thank you for listening to Ground Truth. We'll talk to you next time.